What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Kicks and Picks podcast. We are super excited. It is officially the start of the EPL season. We have a very special double episode for you today, as we are going to give you our picks, our locks for the first week of the year in the Premier League and the state of the club with Arsenal, featuring Arsenal. So full squad here, Nick, along with Scotty and Coach Steve. I could see the back and forth that's been going on this week, the boys are hyped. You're maybe not seeing it in Scotty's face right now. I don't know why that is. That's what I'm looking for. How we feeling, boys?
I'm definitely excited. It was a fun time getting back on the sportsbook apps and start looking through like game day lines as opposed to just kind of digging through the futures that we could find over the course of the summer. I think, weirdly enough, I'm more optimistic about my picks this week, knowing nothing about what the teams are going to look like in the beginning of the season than I was towards the end of last season, where we kind of knew what to expect. And maybe that's just because the books are in the same boat where they're unsure of where to set the lines, and I was able to find some value. But I think last year we all started out really hot. I think the first half of our season up until the World Cup break, we were easily plus money. I think we were up like 30 units, and then we were just kind of holding on in the second half of the season. Still finished plus units, but certainly not our best finish to a season over the past few years. So maybe that trend will continue. Maybe we'll start out hot and then we just have to find a way to stay hot.
Yeah, the first week is always tough, right? Because transfers in and out. You don't know what the lineup's going to look like. I was on RotoWire earlier today as I'm trying to handicap these things, like who's starting, who's maybe rumored to leave and might not play, and those kind of things. But we did finish up. I'm looking at it right now, just about 11 units last season, carried by Nick. I'll throw him a bone there. He was over 8 units plus, so he kept us alive as the season went on. But yeah, it got tougher as the season went on last year as the books caught up. But we started hot, so we'll look to do that again this week. I know Nick and I are a little bit out of our element without Serie A, but we'll be back next week with that. So we'll make it work for this week.
Yeah, this is where the fun starts. And I think one thing I do want to shout out before we get to our picks, we did not do an EPL futures episode, but one of our very good friends, guest of the podcast, Andrew Pissarro at the Plus Money Pod, did a fantastic futures episode. You guys can watch it in like 15 minutes. He ran through just about every single future there was available. We'll link that when we post this. So definitely give it a shout, because I can speak for myself. I agree with a lot of his future picks.
Yeah, and we might have something on for our Patreon patrons. I think there's a few that I saw in terms of like goal scorers and other player props that we could probably get up there in a doc. So if you're listening to this on Thursday and you're a Patreon patron, feel free to give us a look over there. We should have something up. And if you're not a Patreon patron, now is the time to subscribe, because you're going to have a full season of special props. We do usually on each weekday weekend we'll throw up some of our favorite player props. Also some other tidbits that we usually sneak in there throughout the season.
All right, let's roll in, man. We're going to start this episode off hat trick of picks right away. I'm feeling like it's 10-0. So Scotty, why don't you start us with the first winner?
Yeah, and I think for me, like, I wanted to make sure we have the opening match is going to be Manchester City versus Burnley on Friday afternoon. There's nothing that I enjoy more than watching that first match and taking a whole bunch of props. So I will start this season off with a pick in that match. I'm going to take Manchester City and Burnley, both teams to score. Right now it's even money. I'm going to start out by saying this is not your father's Burnley team. We kind of talked about it a little bit last year when Burnley was making their run through the FA Cup. But ever since Vincent Kompany took over, this team is set up to actually score goals. If you remember Burnley from their previous stints in the Premier League, they're very much a defensive first setup. They're really rough and tumble. They kind of epitomize that, traditional English style defense where there's lots of fouls, lots of, play after the whistle, so to speak. But this team in the championship, they led the league in goals. They scored 87 goals last season, which is a healthy number no matter what league you're in. I think Vincent Kompany is going to be setting up their team to attack. He's not going to want to back down and play scared against his former club. So I fully expect them to try to actually challenge City in their opening match. Whether or not that results in a win remains to be seen. Probably not, but I still think they can get a goal. And they've also added a bit in attack in the window this summer. They've added Michael Obafemi from Swansea, who I think had 15
Still playing?
goals. This is a younger one. This might be
there's more.
Yeah, there's other Obafemis, but
Okay.
he's this one from Swansea. He scored, I think, 15 goals in the championship for Swansea last season. They also added a player from Basel, Zeki Mdouni. I think he had 20 goals for them last season, and that's getting added to Nathan Tella, who had 17 goals for Burnley in the championship last season. So plenty of offensive firepower. May not have enough to outscore Erling Haaland and Kevin De Bruyne and that connection that we saw so successful last season, but certainly enough to get on the score sheet, I think, in their opening match.
All right. I'm going to jump over to France for my first one. Ligue 1. Not always the easiest to handicap, but like I said,
Coach Worldwide coming in hot week 1. I love it.
Pick one. Week 1. Pick
Coach
one.
Worldwide does not take any weeks off.
Now, most weeks this would probably be a reach pick. I feel like this week it has a pretty decent chance of hitting because it is week 1. And like I said, those opening weekend matches are always tough to predict, those incoming and outgoing transfers. And no team has seen more star power exit than PSG this summer. Messi's now in MLS tearing it up. Mbappe's frozen out of the side. Some move somewhere is going to be happening soon for him. Neymar potentially leaving as well as he's asked to leave. I mean, we could see a whole new starting trio up top for them in this match as they host Lorient. Throw in the new center back pairing with Skriniar joining Marquinhos. So they're going to have to find their, communication and such there in the back as that new center back pairing. And Skriniar didn't play a lot toward the end of last season with Inter. So I don't know if there's any rust to be shaken off there. I think Lorient can keep this close. In fact, 3 of their last 5 matches against PSG would have covered this. They had 2 1-goal losses and a draw in those 5. I'm looking for the host to win for most likely, but I think they might have a bit of a slow start, and it might be a little bit of a struggle for them early on because of all the changes. And that's at -105.
This might be bullshit, but did I also see that like there's questions around whether Luis Enrique is going to like stick around for the start of the season? I know that there was some like
I can imagine he's probably pissed off with.
I mean, he's losing like everybody, right?
Yeah, I think he's losing everybody. I think he has like the directive to like bench Mbappe if he doesn't extend his contract or something to that. So I don't know if there's any real legitimacy to that rumor, but at the very least, it kind of speaks to the turmoil that's going on within PSG.
And I almost forgot Verratti's not going to be playing most likely because he's got that Saudi move, that's being held up because of the transfer fee. I mean, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, it's definitely
perfect place to strike.
PSG usually a lock in Ligue 1, but this season it's a whole lot.
And they only won the league by 1 point last year too, so they could be vulnerable with all these exits.
I love it.
Fair pick.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to channel my biggest Coach Worldwide I can. I'm using the cheat code because the first pick I give out has to be a winner. And I'm going to Spain, who's also kicking off this week. Real Madrid, money line at plus money, +105 at Athletic Bilbao. I don't really know how this pick is available, so it's the first thing that stood out to me. We are going to slam it. And this kind of typically falls into my underdogs first couple weeks trap game. Is Real going to take it seriously? Now that does not apply to Real Madrid. They are the rule here. Real Madrid at plus money, automatic bet. There's no thinking involved. This is the best line I think I've seen for the entire opening weekend of European football.
Yeah, Bilbao's always tough at home, but looking at Real Madrid's projected lineup, it's their normal 11, throwing in at the addition of Jude Bellingham. So
I
a lot of
do
value
not see
here.
how they don't smoke. Yeah. I mean, at the very least, it should be like the traditional 75th minute Real Madrid 1-0, 2-1 winner.
Do we have props for Vinny Jr. anytime goal scorer yet?
I did not see it.
That may be added to my Patreon.
I will look it up right now as we roll through the picks.
All right. If it's there, you guys get this for free. If it's not there, then you have to check out our Patreon to see that, because I'm going to take that as a prop for this weekend.
I don't see no player parlays led on DraftKings.
All right. Yeah. So that'll be behind our Patreon paywall if you want that. Moving on. I'm going to stick with England. I'm actually sticking with newly promoted clubs. A trend that I loved last year, and I didn't take advantage of it enough, is that these newly promoted clubs in the Premier League, in their first home match, that atmosphere is electric. It's unbelievable. You get that, what I call big game bounce. So there's lots of upsets galore. I didn't feel like taking it with Burnley in the Friday match because Manchester City is a different beast. It's not necessarily worth it, but I will take it here with Sheffield United. They get Crystal Palace in their home opener. Sheffield United draw no bet is +115. So that's going to be my lock. Last season, I just talked about it. Bournemouth, newly promoted, they won 2-0 versus Villa. Forest beat West Ham 1-0, and Brentford smacked United 4-0. So there's definitely some credence there. Crystal Palace, we called them last year this ultimate Jekyll and Hyde club. Some weeks they look great, some weeks they look awful. This year they don't have Wilfred Zaha, who was like one of their main guys, on the wings, always scoring goals, especially against some of the tougher clubs. So without him, we'll see how this attack shapes out. But for me, Sheffield United, I think they have a as good of a chance in this opening weekend to pull off an upset as any club. So getting them draw no bet at plus money to me is a no-brainer.
All right, I'm sticking in the Premier League with my second one. I'm going with Brighton minus a goal and a half at minus 105. They are hosting fellow Serie A newcomers Luton Town. So they lost McAllister this summer. They're likely losing Moises Caicedo as well. He probably won't play in this one as he's awaiting that transfer to Chelsea. Those are big holes to fill. However, I think Brighton and their play style under Roberto De Zerbi will be too much to handle for the EPL new boys at the Amex. It's a home match. I wanted to take team total minus 1.5, but there wasn't even any value there. So I just think taking them minus 1.5, I do think they win this match by 2 goals. Like you said, Scott, and on those first home matches, they usually get that bounce, those newcomers, but I don't see them getting that on the road against a team like Brighton.
Yeah, usually on the road in the first match, it's not the same unless you're playing Liverpool, because that usually happens. But so yeah, maybe we look for their Luton Town's big game bounce for next week. But their stadium, we talked about it, is tiny. It is a true
like 13,000 or something like that.
Yeah, it's a true blue collar stadium. So that'll be interesting. But lots of you mentioned the outgoings for Brighton, coach. I mean, they also have some good incomings as well. I mean, Yao Pedro coming in from Watford should provide them some well needed offensive firepower. And I think they picked up from Dortmund, Dortmund, just to kind of replace the Alexis McAllister move. So, and also I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my guy, James Milner, the ultimate Swiss Army knife. Don't know if he actually plays in this one at 37 years old, but certainly a good guy to pull off the bench if needed.
All right. I have to go with Liverpool for my second bet.
I don't do it.
I'll tell you where I landed. Team total over 1.5. It's at even money at Chelsea. The guys will tell you I really wanted to slam Liverpool. They're plus 135 on the money line. I may still take that bet, but I'm not making it my lock here. I will say that Scotty and 2 friends of the pod, both named Andy, both Liverpool fans, kind of talked me down, just kind of due to that defensive situation, the lack of a defensive midfielder, a little bit of transfer uncertainty still. But to me, that has nothing to do with the fact that they're going to average about 3 goals a game this year. I think Chelsea still stink. I think this could be the team total play of the year, and we're only in week 1. Liverpool's getting 2.
Yeah, I think the thing that helps you is Fofana for Chelsea's out. I think he was probably one of their most promising center halves. I think Badiashile should still be playing, and he's strong. So it'll be up to him really, and him and Reece James to kind of keep Liverpool at bay. And my only concern with Liverpool is their midfield really hasn't been fleshed out yet. Yes, they brought in McAllister and they brought in Szoboszlai, who should provide, sparks offensively. But as we saw with Liverpool last season, when they didn't have possession for good chunks of the game, it isolated their forwards, and didn't matter how strong those guys were. And it's the same guys up top, right? You're still going to have Salah, and you're still going to have Nunez and Diaz and Jota, and Gakpo. But if the midfield doesn't have possession and those guys are isolated, it doesn't really matter how good they are.
2 goals, easy. Maybe 3.
I mean, they should. I mean, they really should, but it's...
There you go. When Scotty, Mr. Pessimistic Liverpool, says that they should score 2, they're probably scoring 4.
I don't know who's more pessimistic on their side, him with Liverpool or you with Lazio, because you're pretty bad yourself.
I will say, but I am going to bring it back. Liverpool, I took them... I want to say I took their team total or maybe the over in the game for Liverpool the first week of last season. And I think that was my only losing pick in the first 2 weeks. I think I was 5-1 with Liverpool letting me down. So we have to reverse that trend.
Yeah. Or just not learn from our mistakes.
No, never.
One of the two.
Never.
All right. So that'll take me into my third and final lock of the weekend. I'm going to go ahead and take Tottenham money line at Brentford. They're plus 135, which is really why I'm taking it. It feels like that's a pretty good value for what we can expect from this Tottenham side. They didn't have the greatest season last year, but Harry Kane should be starting in this one. I don't think his move to Bayern should, or potential move that's to Bayern looks like it's now falling through, should impact that. And he's looked really good under Ange Postecoglou in preseason. He had a hat trick, I think, in his last match. So I'd expect him to kind of drag this offensive line forward. Son should be healthy. I think there's a lot that came up about how he was actually injured for much of last season. Kulusevski is back now as a non-loan player. He's a full Tottenham Hotspur through and through. And then you got Richarlison off the bench, probably, unless Postecoglou does something different. So I think they've got the ability to score. Brentford won't have Nick's guy Ivan Toney suspended for sports betting. Jose Raya likely on his way to Arsenal, so I don't know if he'll be featuring in this match. Who was their really rock solid goalkeeper last year. So lots of holes to fill for Brentford. They didn't do too much in the summer window. So I think they'll probably start the season a little rockier than maybe last season when they came out guns ablaze and like I said, beating Manchester United 4-0. So I'll take Tottenham money line on this one, and hopefully they don't burn me to start the season.
I do want to say I think both Coach Steve and I like this pick as well.
Yeah,
that's really a consideration for a lock.
Yeah, anytime the three of us all are pretty hot on a single pick, that's usually where it starts to get concerning.
No way.
All right, for my last one, I'm gonna finish it up. Also in the Premier League, I'm going Fulham draw no bet at Everton at plus 135. As of now, Fulham really hasn't lost any key contributors from last season's surprise top hat finishing side. And at the moment, Alexander Mitrovic is still with the club and projected to start despite the strong links with a big money move to the Saudi League. So until he goes to the Saudi League, this club can score goals. I don't buy Everton. With him up top, I like the Cottagers to get a result on the road with the protection of the draw no bet.
So this was like the typical game of where I'm like, oh man, I love it. Like underdog, they're like what, +2 something on the money line, right, Coach? Like plus 230, plus 240, maybe even better. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, this is a good spot. And then I'm looking at it again, and I'm saying, what on earth makes Everton like 150 point favorite?
And so they're Everton's plus 120 and Fulham's plus 230 on the money
plus
line.
110 favorite. So like it scares me like how much I liked Fulham here, but this is like I just like you have to go with them because that's the rule. But like, what don't we know? What do we? I'm missing something.
Know here that we do not.
Scary, very scary.
Yeah, you're talking about an Everton side that barely survived last year.
It's the story of Everton, man.
Good bet to get relegated this year. Yeah, I don't know. So interesting to see what happens with that one. I'm going to go to the battle of 14 versus 15 for my last pick. We are taking West Ham draw no bet -120. They're at Bournemouth. Listen, West Ham, kind of a rough year, turned it on towards the end, wound up winning the Conference League. They lost a couple of key guys. We're talking about Paqueta might be on his way out. I heard rumored to City. I don't think it's official yet, so I'm hoping he sticks around and plays this game, but I still think they have enough here to get this done. They're plus 160 on the money line if you're feeling a little bit brave. But the away ties to open up the year, I just think it's a little bit tricky. So I think -120 is a pretty good value here. Draw no bet. You don't have to lay a whole lot, and just praying that West Ham gets off to a better start than they did last year. I don't think I can name 3 players on Bournemouth, so I feel pretty good about this one.
Well,
watch out, Justin Kluivert's there now, Nick.
Even better. Thank you. Can he start?
He is projected to start.
It's gonna throw in Dominic Solanke, one of our favorite anytime goal scorer props, and I think is it Bobby Cordova-Reid? Is he on Bournemouth? Or am I mistaking him? Is he on Forest? He's on Forest.
Proving my point.
I knew it was wrong team. I was gonna say he was there. He was my one of my shot on target parlay guys. But yeah, I think he's on Forest.
All right. Well, hey, here, take us to our pod lock of the week. We're gonna continue to stay hot with that. And what's taking us to 10-0 this week?
Well, it's gonna be one of our podlock favorites, which is going to be Newcastle.
It's our team of the pod, Scott.
Yeah, it is our team of the pod. Absolutely.
It's -135. So a little chalky. They're home, which helps to Villa. Listen, Villa was as hot of a team to end the season last year as anybody. So maybe there's some concern there, but listen, Newcastle just brought in Nick's boy Tonali. And I think the midfield is going to be a much improved part. I think that the offense last season didn't really struggle much. Almiron is still going to be there. Isak is going to be there. Callum Wilson is going to be there. They did lose St. Maximin, but they brought in Harvey Barnes. So, a little like for like replacement there. And when we were talking with our guy Baz, the defense last year was a surprise standout for how little they spent on it. And I think that will likely continue under Eddie Howe. So I think they're going to be as strong of a team as they were last year, probably a bit better, especially with the midfield revamping. And I think it's a tough challenge for Villa to go on the road and open the season at Newcastle. So I like the money line here. I think Newcastle get a win, start their Champions League campaign season where they'll be fighting on multiple fronts. I think they're going to get off on a strong foot here.
Yeah, if it wasn't for the Chelsea-Liverpool match, to me, this is the match of the weekend. These are the two feel-good stories from last year, really. And both teams finish in European spots. I mean, Brighton is in there, too, in that mix. But Newcastle will be interesting to see how they play with expectations now. Last year, there was definitely less expectations on them. Even Villa, to an extent, has more expectations after finishing. I think they finished in the Conference League spot last year, so that'll add a little bit there. But I think these are two good sides. I think it'll be an entertaining match. And I think this match could be won in the midfield, right? I mean, you have Guimaraes, Tonali, and Joelinton against Kamara, Luis, and Diaby. I think that could be the key to this match. Both teams have capable attack, so there could be goals. And I think that Newcastle defense, now Schär is questionable, but if he plays, their defense is intact. I think that could be the difference. I think their defense is just a little stronger than Villa.
And I think overall, sorry, Scotty, the outlook on Newcastle has to be everything they did well last year, but they got to score just a little bit more this year. I feel like more goals are going to come from this team.
Yeah, they should. I think, we kind of talked about it with Baz, but the two-headed, beast that is Callum Wilson and Alexander Isak. I don't know that Alexander Isak starts in this one. He might. We'll see what Eddie Howe kind of lines up and what the formation he goes with. But even if he doesn't start, I mean, bringing him off the bench and having him as like that super sub playing in the last 30 minutes against what could be a team that, hasn't had fully conditioned yet with, the beginning of the season in Villa, that defense might get a little leggy and that's where kind of Isak could shine. So if it is close and they have that ability to bring in Isak off the bench, he could be the difference maker.
Love it. All right. That's going to wrap up our very first week of the 23-24 season hat trick of picks. Let's move on to our special guest of the week. Let's bring on Aaron Lerner from the Short Fuse to discuss Arsenal.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second part of our week one kickoff podcast for the Premier League. This part is going to be State of the Club for Arsenal. We are joined by a very special guest. We have Aaron Lerner joining us. Podcaster of his own. It's the Short Fuse. He's going to be an expert in all things Gunners. A great season for them last year, Aaron. So I'll start there. Congratulations. I know it didn't quite end the way that I think many fans had kind of hoped if you had asked them back in, February, even as late as March. But I think if you look back at it as a whole, rather successful season, rather successful campaign, and something certainly to build off of. So maybe we'll start there. I mean, is that, do you share that same optimistic outlook that I kind of have looking back at Arsenal season, or do you have maybe a little bit more of a, I don't want to say cynical, but a harsher view on how the season went?
Oh, absolutely. I was thrilled with last season for Arsenal. If you'd asked anybody at the beginning of the season what they expected or were hoping for from the season, I think any reasonable person would have said, I'd like to see Arsenal back in the Champions League. You fast forward and it looked like they had a shot at the title, and that ultimately fell short, and so that sort of taints the view of the season as a whole. But if you take a step back and look back at the preseason expectations, you can't help but be thrilled. When Mikel Arteta joined Arsenal, it was not a quick fix that was needed. Arsenal were in a bad spot. They had an old roster, a lot of expensive contracts, not much youth coming through, although they did have Bukayo Saka and Emile Smith-Rowe waiting in the wings. But it was the club was trending in the wrong direction, and they needed to commit to a more thought out and longer rebuild. And they were ahead of schedule last year. Mikel Arteta comes in, starts to turn things around. Europa League for a season. Last season, the goal was to get back into the Champions League. They were already challenging for the Premier League. And I think that that's what the goal would have been coming into this season, is in the Champions League and challenging for the Premier League. So it was, it was found money last year. The one thing I will say is that, Arsenal have never won a European competition, and they were, if they had put out their best side in all of their games and, hadn't sort of, I wouldn't say given up on the Europa League, but had to take a backseat to their competition in the Premier League, they had a legitimate shot at winning that competition, and they sort of let that slip by. And unfortunately, they played William Saliba in that round of 16 tie with Sporting. He got hurt, and that's where it really started to fall apart.
Yeah. And I think at one point I kind of want to stress on, you kind of said it, like when Arteta came in, this wasn't like a quick turnaround. It was a true like rebuild of really a decade of struggle within Arsenal. I think, even looking at Wenger's last 2 or 3 seasons, there was very little positives that you could start to pull away from some of those performances. And like you said, there's a lot of older players on big contracts that typically are tougher to move. But I think when Arteta came in, I remember about a year and a half ago, Nick, we were talking on the podcast about that's like the January transfer window when that closed, who we like to finish in the top 4 between, I think it was Arsenal and Tottenham at the time. And I know you and Coach, our other podcast host, were very high in Tottenham because they brought in Conte, and you guys were just super high on Conte. But
they were spending money, if you don't forget. I mean, that was the other reason they were spending a lot of money.
But I was kind of high on Arsenal just because I think what started to happen was you saw that young core. And that's what I always like when I'm a Liverpool fan. So when I saw, the core forming for Liverpool like 5 or 6 years ago, it kind of gives you that excitement. And you could see that young core starting to form around Martinelli and Saka and Smith Rowe and Odegaard at that point. And so I kind of called them out to, continue to develop and potentially win, or not win, but, get into the Champions League at the end of that season. Didn't work out that way, got into Europa. But it is kind of exciting to see it starting to come together. And this past season, I think, while there may have been a gap here and there and maybe some lack of depth, you could start to really see an 11 coming together that could feasibly be competing for probably like the next 6 or 7 years. Like this isn't just like a 1 or 2 season type wonder. They're all young. They're all within that like 22 to 25 beautiful age range where, they'll be able to play together for many seasons and kind of adapt. So, and to your point about maybe disappointed in missing out on Europa or missing out on winning Europa, I think that's fair. But, like I just said, sometimes it's that depth piece. And when you're in these early stages, you have that like top high level play, and then you're starting 11, but then the drop off kind of kicks in.
And the drop off is what killed the drop off, plus injuries is really what killed them down the stretch. Saliba getting hurt was just a massive difference. They surrendered almost, I think, like a quarter more goals per game with him out of the lineup than in. Their points percentage dropped off significantly without Saliba. And then you add to that, Thomas Partey picked up a knock or on international duty, and so he wasn't 100%, and they didn't have another player in that spot. And Zinchenko hurt his calf down the stretch, and he wasn't there. So they, as you said, they had that established 11, and then not all that much beyond that. But it's funny that, or not funny that you mentioned Liverpool, but Liverpool is the model that I always point to when I talk about sort of the bigger picture for Arsenal, is that Manchester City are a monster. They're a juggernaut. And to compete with them, you need a plan that stretches beyond just, we're going to buy a couple of good players who are older for this season and really go for it. You need to put together a core that grows together and is built to compete. And if you look at Arsenal signed a whole bunch of their young guys to contract extensions over the last year, starting last fall and continuing through Bukayo Saka and William Saliba, who were both extended this summer. And they all have their contracts expiring right around 2027, 2028. So they have that, as you said, this core of this team is going to be together for the next 4 or 5 years. And I'm really excited to watch it.
Yeah, it's great. But I can tell you right now, be careful of 2027, 2028. That's where Liverpool are right now. And we're now suddenly without 6 midfielders and brought in 2 and still trying to backfill. So it's enjoy it while you can, because you always say, 2027, 2028, that's so far off. When it gets there, if the plan hasn't been accounted for, it can get kind of painful.
Well, and I sort of have a renewed or a newfound sympathy for Liverpool and their supporters, because they did it Liverpool did it the right way. They built a great team. You look at the points that Liverpool were putting up their seasons, they finished second to Manchester City. You look what Arsenal did this season, finishing second to Manchester City. Yeah. Those teams should be winning the league. Yep. And it's just because they have this juggernaut ahead of them that they're not.
Yeah, 95 points used to be good enough to win you the league 99.9% of the time. Now it's like it's a coin toss if you can win it. So I know we're talking about the positives, and maybe there's some players that we haven't really discussed, that maybe quite didn't perform to expectations last season, or maybe you're looking for like a significant rebound or improvement this season. Are there any players that come to mind when you're kind of reviewing how they performed last season compared to expectations?
Yeah, 2 guys jump to mind. The first is Emile Smith-Rowe. 2 years ago, he was Arsenal's second leading Premier League goal scorer. He scored 10 goals, which was second to Bukayo Saka. And he was excellent. Looked to be trending in the same direction as a blossoming young star that, you saw with Odegaard, that you saw with Saka. Last year was just a lost season for him. He had I think it was a sports hernia, but it was some sort of hip problem at the beginning of the year that kept him out. And then they decided to do surgery. And so that kept him out even longer. He came back, started to get, some minutes, and then got hurt again. He just couldn't stay healthy, couldn't find his form. And so he really had a lost season. We joke in Arsenal parts about like a new signing, because it was something that Arsene Wenger used to talk about, but he will be like a new signing because they basically didn't have him last year. And he's a really good young player. I mean, he just won the under 21 Euros with England. Another guy that jumps out is Fabio Vieira. He arrived with a good deal of sort of hype around his skill on the ball, but he picked up a foot injury 2 summers ago, or the summer that he came to Arsenal. And so he missed basically all of preseason, which sort of slowed his integration into Arteta's system and into the team. And then he kind of struggled with the pace and physicality of the Premier League because he's a pretty small guy. But he showed, flashes of brilliance. He can really pick a pass. He's an excellent ball striker. So he's been getting plenty of time in the preseason too. It seems as though Mikel Arteta trusts him, which is a big thing with Arteta, because there are guys on the roster that it becomes pretty clear that he doesn't trust. And so they basically don't get any time. It seems like Vieira is a guy that he trusts and he wants him to develop, and he's going to be a little bit bigger in the rotation. So if you want sort of a kind of a dark horse player to break out from Arsenal this year, it would be Fabio Vieira for me.
So one thing that's impressive, I think, you mentioned Liverpool doing things the right way currently. We could make a really great argument for Arsenal doing that over decades, right? So when Wenger was in charge, they had this culture. Everybody bought in. He was the guy that was going to lead this squad. The board bought in. The transfers were to his liking. The players all performed. Are we seeing that as kind of like a 2.0 right now? You mentioned ahead of schedule. Is Arteta that guy? Is he going to be the next one that's here for 10 plus years? And I'll ask you before I give my thoughts.
I hope so. To the extent that any manager in the modern football can stay somewhere for 10 years, Arteta has as good a chance as any. My concern is that, Barcelona or maybe Real Madrid, one of the Spanish sides, might tempt him away in a few years. But yeah, you can't help but be impressed with what they've accomplished, at least in terms of a improvement in the quality of play on the pitch, in he and Edu's plan to rebuild the roster with youth. 2 years ago, they were the youngest average starting lineup in the Premier League. Last year, Southampton beat them out by just a little bit, so they were the second youngest. I wouldn't be surprised if they were among the youngest again this year, just because they added young players still, and their core or their starting 11 dropped Granit Xhaka, who was a older guy who was sort of pulling that average up. So, Arteta has done great things. I think one of the places where some might have some legitimate criticism is Arteta is translating that improvement on the pitch into tangible results. I don't think that Arsenal bottled it down the stretch last year, but there are plenty of people who, accuse him of really kind of screwing it up, that they were in the driver's seat and then they sort of deteriorated down the stretch. He's only won one piece of silverware, well, 2 community shields, but two community shields, plus he won the FA Cup in the weird COVID summer. But I think that a lot of people who put more stock in your silverware return than I do would point to that as another sort of potential issue with him. But I think that he's a fantastic manager. I think what he's done is great. And at the risk of going on too long, I think one of the biggest things is the way that he and the club have rebuilt the connection with their supporters. You look back at the Unai Emery interval between Wenger and where we are now, and the lasting image is Granit Xhaka walking off the pitch at the Emirates, being booed off, flipping the bird to the fans and telling people to F off. Arteta comes in, personally convinces Xhaka to stay, and then in Xhaka's last match at Arsenal at the end of last season, he scores a brace and the Emirates supporters are singing, "Granit Xhaka, we want you to stay." They are building something special, both with the young roster and then also with reforging a real connection between the fans and the team that had really gotten incredibly toxic coming out of the Wenger years and through that Unai Emery time.
Yeah, I think that's actually maybe a good transition. So we're at a pretty good point, it seems, in terms of Arteta's kind of turnaround of Arsenal and where they are now. Moving into next season, do you see any significant gaps, or were there any significant gaps that needed to be filled? Obviously, Xhaka moving on, and how do you think Arsenal has addressed them so far in the summer transfer window?
I think they've had a great summer, and I'll spin back to Liverpool's squad building, because the way I see it, they built the core, they had the pieces in place, and then they took their big swing with their record-breaking transfer for Virgil van Dijk, and he was the guy that put them finally over the hump. Maybe Declan Rice, hopeful for me, I hope Declan Rice is that piece for Arsenal. He's the record British transfer, 100 million plus 5 million in add-ons, and he was at a position of critical need for Arsenal. That sixth spot, although it looks like right now he might start the season more of a hybrid 6-8 role, but he's their big swing, and he's going to be the number 6 for years to come, because Thomas Partey, while excellent when in form, has some other issues that he's dealing with, and then is also on the wrong side of 30 and has shown that he breaks down physically down the stretch. That was a huge get for them. Kai Havertz will be the sort of closest like-for-like replacement for Granit Xhaka in that advanced left 8 role. I'm excited about it. I think he's a really good player who just, because of Chelsea's other issues, because he was maybe being used out of position, hasn't really been unlocked. And I think that Arteta might be able to get something more out of him. Jurrien Timber looks like he's going to be incredible. I thought that he was, coming in to sort of back up on the right side. the last few games of the preseason, he's actually been in the Zinchenko role and has been really good in it. Maybe not quite as talented on the ball, or they're still very good on the ball, but with a little bit more defensive acumen. I would say if there was one gap remaining, it's another attacker, specifically somebody to back up Bukayo Saka, because he played, actually, I think the last 2 seasons, he played every Premier League game. And at some point, especially with how he gets fouled, similar to, guys like Mo Salah getting just the snot knocked out of him by defenders, because that's the only way you can stop him. At some point, he's going to break down or just need a rest. And so that's the biggest remaining gap.
So it's so interesting. You mentioned Havertz. I'm looking at Rice. You paid a lot of money for these guys, but you know what? If they fit in, if they perform, no one's going to remember. No one's going to care, right? It's going to look, the number will be an afterthought. And I think you're spot on with Havertz. He's one of those guys where I almost feel like you can't really quantify what he does on the pitch, but if you watch him, you know that there's something there. And could this change of scenery be exactly what he needs to really explode?
He's big too. He's 6'3".
Right.
I didn't realize that until I was, watching Arsenal more closely. And I guess watching him around the Arsenal attackers too, because Saka and Martinelli and Gabriel Jesus are all kind of short.
Yeah.
So he stands out, standing near those guys. But he also, that height and his talent at sort of those late arriving runs gives Arsenal another dimension. You see a lot of, trying to work it down towards the touchline and then cut it back. But when Gabriel Jesus and diminutive wingers are the guys you're aiming at, those cutbacks have to be on the ground. Kai Havertz with a late arriving run gives our Arsenal sort of an aerial option for those as well. So yeah, I think that he could be another one of those guys that has a big season and people are kind of like, oh, where did that come from?
I think one of the pieces we talked about that Arsenal kind of missing was that depth. And you mentioned that maybe a backup for Saka was missing. We also see that there's going to be some outgoings as well. So Matt Turner out, probably bringing in David Raya, it seems. Tierney mentioned is potentially going out. And then we also have U.S. player, Florian Balogun, and then Nicolas Pepe, who was maybe the biggest flop for Arsenal in the past 5 to 7 years. I don't know if you can come up with a bigger one, but
no, he is.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's kind of still going to be an issue that Arsenal could face this season if the current incomings that you have, the ones that we've listed so far, are the ones that are it for the season?
Depth, I think they're pretty well set, other than that attacker spot. And yeah, I was thinking about it as I was preparing for the podcast, and I think that the hope is probably that Reece Nelson, who came through the Arsenal Academy and scored that big time at the death goal last season, that he is maybe the backup in that spot. He has not really proven himself in anything other than substitute appearances, but I think that maybe he slots in there. But other than that, I think the Arsenal depth is pretty good. You mentioned Balogun, you mentioned Pepe, and Kieran Tierney to a lesser extent. The Arsenal squad is still a little bloated. I think I saw today that they have something like 30 first team players right now. They have to trim that number down.
Sounds some to Liverpool, because I think we're at 22.
We don't have very many midfielders to spare. That seems
okay. That
might not be all that interesting. So Kieran Tierney is pretty far down the depth chart at left back. He has Zinchenko. He has apparently Jurrien Timber, Jakub Kiwior last season, who came in at the January deadline, has gotten time there in the preseason ahead of him. Takahiro Tomiyasu has played some left back. So, he's a really good player, and I love him. The Arsenal fans really love him, but there doesn't really seem to be all that many minutes for him. So he's a guy that might be on the way out. Balogun is going to be sold. It's just a question of where to. He didn't participate in the Arsenal media day. So you look through the image services, to put on the header, little inside baseball here, image services to put through for headers for our posts. And you just type in, whatever player you want. Every name comes up, with your kind of standard stock photos, the guys touching the badge, all of that. Balogun didn't take any of those in Arsenal kits, which is a pretty big sign to me that, he's going to be sold. It looks like it'll come down to a bidding war, hopefully for Arsenal's sake, between Monaco and Inter Milan. Yep. Nicola Pepe, they're either going to sell him for pennies on the dollar or mutually agree to terminate his contract. That was just a miss. It was a transfer that might have been a bit too influenced by agent connections and friendships and people looking to line their own pockets in the deal. Of course, that's all just the scuttlebutt. None of that is confirmed, but there was something very wrong with that price tag. And, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to Arsenal because it's still 72 million out the window and hardly any of it none of it recouped. But, you just got to write it off. Terrible transfer, huge flop. We move on.
Yeah. I think maybe we'll wrap up some of the summer talk. And it's a question I've kind of wanted to ask an Arsenal supporter for a while. So I think you're going to be the guy that gets to answer it for me. For the last decade, Kroenke out has been this like rallying call for Arsenal fans online, outside the stadium, inside the stadium at certain points, during some of the low points. Has that started to die down now with the success that you guys have been seeing with Arteta and with some of the investment that, you're starting to see, especially with some of the guys we mentioned, Declan Rice and Kai Havertz coming in for pretty significant sums? Or do you think there's still an underlying level of distrust between the Arsenal supporters and the ownership group?
I think that those have died down pretty significantly, almost entirely. One of the things that I'll point to is, I think it was about 5 years ago, but I might not be totally correct on the timeline. The Kroenkes consolidated their shares and took basically all of the remaining shares and bought a bunch of the outlying shares. And so they became basically entire owners of the club in its entirety. And since then, there has been significant investment year upon year. I think that, I can't believe that I'm saying this because I'm not a big fan of any, billionaire sports team owners, but I think that they actually got a little bit of a bad rap. The struggles that the club went through, and the apparent lack of investment came during a time when they weren't full owners of the club, when there was sort of this power struggle between them and other owners. There was a power struggle between Arsene Wenger and various people who were in some capacity or other directors of football. So they had a lot of different people. Arsenal as a club had a lot of different people pulling in a bunch of different directions. And that all got laid at the feet of the owners. And I guess that the buck stops here with an owner. But once everything sort of got consolidated and sorted out, they brought in Edu, they brought in Mikel Arteta. There's a coherent plan. Everything's, proceeding according to that plan. It's, the Kroenke out thing has really stopped. And I think there might be something to, you look at the Kroenke's other sports properties, they won the Super Bowl.
Successful, to say the least.
They won the Stanley Cup with the Avalanche. They won the NBA with the Nuggets. I think that success breeds success. I think that I can only speak to how it would feel for me. But, if I were a sports team owner and my team started winning, I think that would feel pretty good. And you would want more of that. And so you would, do what it takes to get more of that. And I think that Arsenal might be, reaping the rewards there that, they realize, oh, hey, this winning titles thing is pretty sweet. Let's try and do it at Arsenal too.
Yeah, I think maybe there's an empty spot in the trophy cabinet for something from Arsenal. So maybe that's how we can kind of get into our next season preview. Looking ahead at the upcoming campaign, what are your expectations for what Arsenal can potentially achieve? Do you think that, they're next in the trophy winning Kroenke sports franchises?
I'd really love to say that I do think they are next, and they probably are next, at least in terms of Kroenke's properties, but I don't think that they're the favorites in any of the competitions that they're in. We talked a little bit earlier about Manchester City being a juggernaut, and the Premier League is theirs to lose. They're the best team. They have the most resources. They've done it 3 years running now. They know what it takes to win. And so they're favorites. I actually saw Opta ran, I don't know, 10,000 or 100,000 simulations. Manchester City won the Premier League 90% of the time of their simulations. And, maybe their numbers are a little off. Maybe they're weighting some things a little bit too heavily, but like that's what Arsenal and Liverpool and the other clubs are dealing with. It's that level of disparity. Could they win the Premier League? Sure. They almost did last year until, they were derailed by some injuries and fatigue. It might sound a little crazy, but I actually think that Arsenal have a better chance to win the Champions League than they do the Premier League. Mm-hmm. And that's not
fewer games. And
exactly. Yeah. It's a knockout competition. You don't have to be better than Manchester City, 38 match weeks. You got to beat them, if you draw them in a regular line, you got to beat them twice or once and draw them. Or if you draw them in the final, you got to beat them once. You don't have to be the best team in the competition. You just have to be the best team on the right day. And last year, before they sort of wilted and withered down the stretch, Arsenal's underlying numbers had them anywhere from 5 to 10 in terms of teams in, the best teams in all of Europe. So, there's no reason why if a team, with that kind of quality, they have enough quality that if they catch lightning in a bottle, they play well on the right days, that's what they do. Now, I'm not saying that I expect them to win the Champions League. I think my expectations for the Champions League are for Arsenal to get out of their group and, maybe win a knockout tie or two. And then, who knows? Because at that point you got everybody left is really good and it's a crapshoot, but that's sort of where I see it. Maybe they win an FA Cup, that's kind of.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, how do you think, Arteta will prioritize rotation amongst, especially if you go, if you're going Premier League and Champions League, you're talking like 55 plus matches across just those two, not counting the domestic cups. Obviously domestic cups, you'll probably see more rotation, more of the younger players get in, but if push came to shove, do you think Arteta's prioritizing Champions League? Or do you think he's going to prioritize Premier League if we're getting to a point like in April next year where Arsenal find themselves doing, exceedingly well in both competitions?
I think he would probably try to win both at that point. I don't think that he would sacrifice one for the sake of the other. And I think that if Arsenal are healthy, they may finally have enough depth to do that. Mm-hmm. I think that the concept of rotation is gets a little overblown in sort of the public online discourse. You look at the actual numbers of how many matches the top players from, say, a Manchester City or a Liverpool play when they make deep runs in the Premier League, challenging for the title and the Champions League. They're playing most of those matches. The Mo Salahs, the Jack Grealishes, the Erling Haalands, for Arsenal, the Bukayo Sakas, they're playing all of those games. It's not a question of, do you sit Bukayo Saka for a Champions League semifinal so that he's fresh for the weekend in the Premier League? No, you play him in both if you need him in both. Maybe if you're playing somebody weaker in the Premier League, you can maybe get him 60 minutes of rest in the Premier League or whatever, but they play in both of those.
Yeah, I think the extra substitutions will help too. I think that's common. That's been a common issue, and speaking from a Liverpool fan's experience, we've seen it with players like Mo Salah, where they go to AFCON and they play every minute of every match for their club. And in the most recent AFCON, I think Salah had 2 out of his 3 knockout round matches went to extra time, so he's playing 120 minutes plus pens. When he came back, he was a different player. He was definitely, like, you could tell he was a little bit off pace, and for Salah, his pace is 90% of what makes him extraordinary. And he suffered from it. I think he had 3 or 4 goals in the second half of that season in the league because he just didn't quite have that extra level. So I think the rotation piece maybe isn't so much, hey, we're not going to play this player for the full game. It's more so like, hey, we're going to, either sub him on in the second half, or he's only going to play 60 and we'll rotate that way.
Yeah. Well, and that's where the added depth, both this summer and the previous summer, that's why I circle back to guys like Fabio Vieira and Emile Smith-Rowe. If Arsenal really are going to make a deep run in the Champions League and challenge for the Premier League, or maybe, play deep into the FA Cup, they're going to need those guys to step up and have, impactful seasons, because those guys are going to have to take more minutes and more meaningful minutes off the plates of, the first 11.
And it kind of, there used to be the term super sub. And I think that used to be something where like every once in a while you would have a team where you're bringing in, this player that can have a 20 goals, season, but he's coming in off the bench because there's another player in front of him that can do 25 goals a season. But I think that's more common now. Like Liverpool have Diego Jota, who's probably not going to be starting in the front three in any of the matches, but certainly could be in most squads would be. But it's pretty common to kind of rotate him in that way where, you're resting your starter's legs, but also you've got a guy that has completely fresh legs running against a defense that's just played an hour against, chasing Mo Salah and Luis Diaz, and similar for Arsenal, right? They're going to be chasing Martinelli and Saka. So having someone like Reece Nelson or Eddie
Leo
Nketiah
Trossard,
or Leo
Leandro
Trossard,
who had a great, we sort of glossed over the point where I was going to mention Leo Trossard earlier, but he was an unbelievable addition. Arsenal sort of missed out on Mykhailo Mudryk, and everybody was really bummed because that was going to be a big money, flashy move. They got Leo Trossard instead, and he scored 6 or 7 goals for Arsenal and added the same number of assists in half a season. He was excellent. He's going to be one of the super subs for Arsenal this year.
Yeah. So like the sub becomes less about saving legs of the starter and it just as much about maybe there's like a strategical shift that the manager's trying to make in terms of, hey, we saw that this defensive lineup has a gap here and we can exploit it with fresh legs with player A, B, or C.
Yeah. And that sort of leads me into another thing that I think was one of Arsenal's goals this summer. And you've seen it in the preseason. Mikel Arteta has been trying a bunch of different guys in different spots. Kai Havertz playing the left 8. Declan Rice played the left 8 against Manchester City. I think Arsenal kind of got solved last season. They played one way. They had Zinchenko inverting from the left back. They built up in the same ways with Martinelli and Saka trying to get around the outside. Ben White overlapping on the right side. Gabriel Jesus maybe sort of checking, turning, and spinning. They became a little formulaic in how they attacked. Even though the attack had improved greatly, they really only had sort of a limited number of ways in which they could beat you. And I think that sort of getting at what you just said, one of the things they're trying to do this season is become more variable. If you'll sort of borrow a term from other sports, they're trying to find more ways to break down defenses, more ways that they can beat you, perhaps have more players in the rotation so that, just as you said, they can target a specific weakness. Say, Gabriel Martinelli isn't necessarily the best guy to attack the right side of a specific defense. Okay, well, they have Trossard who wants to play a little bit more inside compared to Martinelli's width, and they can exploit a weakness like that. So I think that has been a big effort. Now, the flip side of that, unfortunately, is I'm not sure that Arsenal are going to get off the sort of the rip-roaring, red-hot start that they had last year, because I'm not sure that the first 11 is necessarily set. They've been trying the downside of all of these experiments is, you try something and sometimes it doesn't work. It might help you down the road because they either got experience playing in those positions with each other. So the next time they do it, they're better, or what you can't try down the road because it doesn't work. But Arsenal may draw a match that they should have won, or maybe drop points early in the season because things aren't as settled as they were last year.
Yeah. Happens all the time to Liverpool. Awesome. So let's wrap up. Before we go, we have one segment we like to do on the podcast. We just call it buy or sell. So we have 3 statements that we'll make, and you can tell us if you're buying those statements or if you want to sell them. So the first statement we have: will Arsenal finish as the top club in London yet again this season?
That is an easy buy. I think that Chelsea will be dramatically improved because I think
Mhm.
Pochettino is a good manager and I think he'll sort it out. But I think that, Arsenal are ahead of Chelsea in the development, and I think the Tottenham are going in the wrong direction.
Interesting.
So yeah, easy buy on that one for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think weirdly enough, I'm kind of high on Pochettino at Chelsea. It's not quite the same structure as he had at Spurs, where he was kind of, I think, overachieving. It's not quite the same as PSG either. It's a little in between, but I think, or not Chelsea, at PSG. But I think, he definitely has the ability to kind of turn them around, but just not in a one season type thing, no matter how much they spend.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is they have so many players. He's going to spend, a quarter of the season, maybe even half the season, sort of figuring out what he's got with all of those guys and all those spots. So,
yeah. All right. Next one. 50 plus goals combined by Saka, Jesus, and Martinelli in just the Premier League. So I think last season they combined for 40, but Jesus had that injury that saw him miss a healthy chunk of the season. If all three stay healthy, do you see them eclipsing that 50 goal mark?
I'm actually going to sell that because I think that Arsenal's scoring is going to be even more distributed among different players. So last year, Arsenal had 4 players score double-digit goals. The 3 that you mentioned, plus Martin Odegaard, got 15. I actually just wrote this today. My sort of bold prediction for Arsenal is that they're going to have 6 double-digit goal scorers: Saka, Martinelli, Odegaard, Gabriel Jesus, Leandro Trossard, who had 8 goals last season, and Kai Havertz. I'm buying the Kai Havertz hype. So I think that the 3 that you mentioned, Saka, Gabriel Jesus, and Gabriel Martinelli, won't get to 50 on their own just because other guys are going to take their goals. But those 6 together are going to get to 60. So not buying exactly what you were selling, but giving you
there's a reason.
I'll put it. I'll turn
it's
it back
not a
to
pessimistic.
you.
It's not a pessimistic sell.
I'll turn it back to you. Are you going to buy or sell my 6 guys with double-digit goals?
So I what I'm trying to do is I think Jesus and Saka can probably get to 40 combined. I think that's probably realistic what it'll be. My question is Martinelli, because I feel like Martinelli does a lot more distribution too compared to those other guys. So I think if Martinelli can get 12 to 15, I think they'll do it. Because I really do think that you'll see Jesus and Saka, because it kind of reminds me of when Firmino and Mane and Salah were all kind of running through. I know you guys have a little bit more depth behind, but I can see them getting to that 50. If Martinelli can get to like 12 to 15, I think it's definitely achievable.
I definitely think Martinelli will. I think that Martinelli actually flies under a lot of people's radar because Bukayo Saka, who is a bona fide superstar at this point, is on the opposite wing. Gabriel Jesus with the big name, Martin Odegaard putting in 15. I think Martinelli flies under the radar, and he's really good in his own right too. So that's another guy. I mentioned dark horses guy. I think that to the extent that a guy who had the season he did could even be a dark horse, but I think that he is maybe not getting his due, and that he could have a real big year, and people look back and say, "Wow, we were actually kind of sleeping on that guy."
No, it's not ability that I think will limit him, right? I think it's just, like you said, where the opportunities come from, because they have so much talent elsewhere. All right, last one, we'll go into Champions League. Arsenal making their long-awaited return, or maybe not so long, depending on your perspective. Do you buy that they will win their group in the Champions League group stage?
I will reluctantly buy that one. Not having seen the draw, it's always tough because they could draw
which pot are they in? Are they in pot 3?
They're in pot 2.
Oh, they are in pot 2.
Yeah, so they're in pot 2.
That's good. Yeah.
The results in the other leagues broke favorably down the stretch. There was a question whether they would be in 2 or 3, but the way that it worked out with, I think Italy impacted it and Spain impacted it, maybe. However it broke down the stretch, it broke favorably, and Arsenal wound up in pot 2. You could draw into a group with like Real Madrid, and it would be, it would not be a smart bet to put money on Arsenal winning a Champions League group with Real Madrid in it. Some of the other teams in pot 1, absolutely. So, maybe they do get Real Madrid and they split with them and somehow managed to win the group. So yeah, reluctant buy, with the caveat that I'm not sure that they can top one of the, the real blue blood clubs.
Yeah, as long as they can avoid like a Real. I mean, obviously they're going to avoid anyone from England, so I think that helps.
Yeah,
I think you're looking at Spain. I think they'll beat anybody from Italy. I don't think Napoli will be that strong this year. Looking at some of the Milan clubs, I think Arsenal can come out on top of those guys. So and Bayern's going to be down. Bayern will be down.
You still, I mean, if you had your choice, you'd rather avoid Bayern than get them.
Sure,
I think.
Sure, but I think Arsenal would be able to come out on top on that. Awesome. All right. Well, that wraps up Buy or Sell. That wraps up this episode. Aaron, thank you so much for joining. Can you remind our listeners one more time where they can find you?
Yeah, sure. I'm at Aaron C. Lerner on Twitter, also, or X, I guess now. And also I do most of the tweeting for at the Short Fuse as well. And then obviously theshortfuse.com. That's where all of my Arsenal stuff goes, and that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Well, best of luck this season. We'll be keeping our eyes on Arsenal. I think there's going to be a lot of favorable picks on our side in favor of Arsenal. So yeah, that will wrap up this week's episode. Hope everyone has a great week watching the opening weekend of Premier League. We'll be back again next week, recapping the weekend and starting to preview some of those matches then. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. But until then, we'll talk to you guys next week.